Good afternoon and welcome back to Housing Assembly and to the session, to our session, The Local Context. I'll do a little introduction to the session in a second, but first just to kind of ahead talk through who will be talking today. We have Emma Appleton, Sophie Dyring, Andy Fergus, Thomas Gilbert, Jeremy McLeod, Kerstin Thompson and Toby Pond. We're also joined by Michael Molson, who you may have heard speaking earlier today. We have him joined with us today to provide some perspective on our local context. And we will also be joined by our graphic recorder, Zara, to help capture our thinking. She'll be making a live illustration of our main themes today. We'll be checking back throughout the session to see her progress. So today essentially this session is essentially a discussion. I wanted each one of the speakers to kick off by giving us a short 2 to 3 minute introduction of who they are and essentially put them in context for the audience as to their kind of role and their kind of participation in today's discussion. So before they do introduce themselves, I guess a bit of an overview in terms of how I see the conversation developing. First of all, for those of you who have looked at a number of the sessions so far over the last few days, we've seen economists and planners and sociologists and a range of different disciplines and related kind of practices discussing their role in housing, and it's been tremendously engaging. This session is perhaps a little bit different insofar as, in fact, most of this day, in that it really does focus on design professionals. And so the discussion today will be talking mainly about how the design professionals engage with this subject. Obviously, there will be opportunities to connect and link to other subjects because the subject requires it, but it will be a design-led conversation. I'm hoping that the conversation can also move between scales because we all recognize that the subject of housing relates both to the macro and to the big questions of today and also to the micro and to, you might say, the more tactical responses that designers and architects can bring. I'm conscious that the word housing has a range of different applications and that it is used kind of in relation to obviously public housing, into affordable housing, and into broadly the understanding of housing, which is beyond that. And I would hope that our conversation can observe the distinctions between different types of housing and how we move forward. Finally, I suppose there is a lot of conversation over the last few days and broadly this conversation, as witnessed by only last week, the Four Corners TV show on ABC. There's a lot of discussion around housing that's quite worrying. There's a mess of affordability. There's all sorts of planning constraints. There's a resistance to density, there's income disparities, and there's climate change emissions, and there's a whole range of things that are, you might say, the downside and possibly the consequences of about 50 years of inactivity. But we also have lots of upsides. We have innovations in housing models and in construction techniques. We have, at the moment, we've got low inflation rates and therefore cheap lending. We have growing institutional investment in new sectors like the build to rent and others. And in Victoria, we have the massive public investment in housing through the big build. So I'm hoping that this session can strike a balance between being, on the one hand, not shy of identifying problems and issues and challenges and doing so candidly and fulsomely, but also to help us identify and celebrate and support the constructive work that's being done by members who are joining us today, by architects and other people joining us today, but also widely within the community. So we can really understand this balance of what's going well and what might need to be done better. So that's my kind of little 2-minute overview of what I'm hoping this conversation will go today. But I'd like to now just introduce each one of the speakers in turn to briefly say a few words about themselves and put themselves in this context. So I'll start, we're just going to go alphabetically, starting with Emma Appleton. I wonder, could you say a few words, Emma?
Thanks, Andrew. And look, I'm delighted to be here today. I'd like to start by, first of all, acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I am the Director of Portfolio Development, Future Homes, Future Projects and Planning at Homes Victoria, which is the government's agency that was previously Department of Housing, but is reforming and reframing to really deliver an extraordinarily diverse and ambitious program. My background is in landscape architecture, architecture and urban design. And previously I've held roles across public agencies such as the City of Melbourne, and previously the Commission for Architecture and Built Environment in London, where I led a program around sustainable communities, housing growth and housing market renewal. Current role is really focusing on being part of the broader agency, but very particularly focused on delivering the big housing build, a very ambitious program of the state government, of the Victorian government, to deliver 12,000 social and affordable homes across Victoria in quite short time. And this investment is unprecedented and very exciting. I guess my interest in this conversation today is how we deliver a very ambitious program. As I said, over 12,000 homes, $5.3 billion worth of investment into social and affordable homes across the state. How do we do that and embed design thinking and design excellence in the program so that we have a legacy? And how do we take the opportunities on the different and very diverse sites across the state to really, optimise the outcomes on these and transform neighbourhoods in the process, transform people's lives in the process. My specific role is around two of the delivery channels within the big housing build, which is Delivery Channel 1 on Homes Victoria land. We have major land assets across the state, which where our housing estates. And we also are looking at other government land to enable great projects in highly accessible locations in areas of need across the state. And so looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, Andrew.
Sophie Dyring. Thank you, Emma. We now have Sophie Dyring.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd also like to pay my respect to elders on the land in which we all meet today, and I'm coming to you from the Wurundjeri land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So the context of me within housing, I'm the Director of Schored Projects, and we're an architecture and landscape architecture design practice with a social agenda. We believe in good design that should be available to all regardless of gender, ethnicity or socioeconomic background. And we work with clients who share these values of social justice, inclusivity and fairness. I've worked with many of Victoria's community housing providers, including Aboriginal Housing Victoria, Women's Property Initiatives, United VicTas, Housing Choices, Launch Housing, Haven Home Safe, and with Homes Victoria, who all have their particular needs and requirements for their residents. We predominantly have designed and delivered customised social housing for these clients, and in recent years we've been working in the SDA or disability accommodation space. We've been working in the social housing sector for nearly a decade, and in that time we've delivered or have under construction or design over 290 homes worth a value of about $55 million. We integrate the two design disciplines of architecture and landscape architecture from the inception of a project, as we believe that the integration provides more certain outcomes for our clients in terms of conceptual agenda, sustainability and cost. I'm supported by a dedicated team that share the values of my practice, and the culture within, and our culture affords me to extend my contribution to social and affordable housing beyond practice. I am a social housing advocate, an affordable housing advocate, and I've co-convened symposiums, presented at conferences, written on the subject, and led research projects. I see 4 design objectives being explored in our work and also in the work of the international projects that were presented earlier today. And they are flexibility and multiplicity, construction methodologies and prototyping, sustainability, encompassing environmental, social and cultural, and the individual and the collective. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Sophie. Could we invite Andy Fergus next?
Thanks, Andrew. I'll also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which is also Wurundjeri country. I'm the head of urban design at Assemble Communities, but I also have a complicated number of roles as the advocacy lead of the newly reformed Urban Design Forum, as well as being an urban design practitioner with my own practice. I've benefited from the tutorage of a number of people on this panel, informally or otherwise, including Emma Appleton and Jeremy in particular. But my role is very much a kind of hybrid role across the space of urban design, architecture and urban planning. And I'm very much interested in the design of systems rather than things. So a lot of my work is involved in the interface between architecture and regulation and the upstream factors that determine design quality and the types of environments that we produce. So at Assemble, we currently have, I can't keep up, but I think we've got 12 current projects with an end value of around 3 billion across the portfolio of build to rent and build to rent to own, which represents a really significant attempt at sort of addressing private investment-led mixed tenure housing. So a mix of moderate and social housing, piloting inclusionary housing without any regulatory obligation to do that. So we're designing a number of major precinct developments, which incorporate mixed tenure throughout the precinct of a scale perhaps comparable to some of the Homes Vic projects, and are really interested in that kind of total environmental design, from public realm to communal space to residents, and really addressing that question of tenure blindness in the lives of residents, ensuring they can afford the things on the ground plane, etc. So I guess what I sort of hope to contribute today as someone who sits slightly above the individual projects that a number of others will talk about is the sort of preconditions that enable innovation in social housing, in market housing, etc. And this is something which I'm particularly sort of well poised to bring, having been involved with Nightingale, Wise Housing, property collectives, as well as Assemble Communities in my current role. So I have a good oversight over a range of different innovative housing models that are occurring in Melbourne at the moment. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andy. Can I invite Thomas Gilbert next?
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, my name is Thomas Gilbert. I'm a principal at Hayball Architects in Melbourne. I come from a housing background, working through all different scales of housing, from individual housing through student accommodation, and most recently, social and affordable housing has been a major focus. So really, what Hayball as a practice has been focusing on lately is the new alternative housing themes that are coming through, especially in Victoria. And we've been heavily involved with the public sector, with Homes Victoria. We're doing a lot of master planning work in a series of large precincts through Wave 1 and Wave 2, as it's known. So Emma is essentially our client. We've also been involved in the sort of more institutional investment in social housing through PPP projects, the PHRP projects, for instance, and also then moving into the Assemble Communities in the build to rent to own and build to rent with Andy Fergus, as he just mentioned. So more of the institutional investment into affordable housing and what that could be at a larger scale, and focusing on communities and precincts of mid to large scale. We've also been involved with a lot of community housing providers as well, Housing Choices, Housing First, Launch Housing, and others. And really, Hayball likes to consider the community as a key part of the design. The other thing to mention is we've also been involved with Nightingale to an extent in some of the Nightingale Village that's being built at the moment. So we'd really like to get involved and use some of our, I guess, large practice experience with commercial built-to-sale apartments into this housing area. So we come at it from a concept of trying to bring the maximum amount of affordability and placemaking and community design, and also to really consider within public realm and the social regulations and planning regulations that we've spent a lot of time talking with Assemble and Homes Victoria about. Thanks, Andrew. I think that sums it up.
Super, thanks. Could I invite Jeremy McLeod next?
Thanks, Andrew. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land today, the land upon which Breathe Architecture stands, the land upon which Nightingale Housing was founded, and the land upon which we build most of our Nightingale housing. I'm here today in my Nightingale Housing capacity, not my Breathe Architecture capacity. But a bit of background on me. Andy, I'm flattered that you think that that I tutored you, because I think that you tutored me. So I think it's a mutual appreciation society. And your work on the village was exceptional. But, you know, I think that for me as an architect at Breathe Architecture, we care deeply about sustainability. We care deeply about society. And we watched a housing system kind of, you know, devouring itself and the community around us in Brunswick. We bought a site and delivered that in 2013 under the incredible work of an architect called Bonnie Herring. It was called The Commons. And then we opened it up for 18 months as a prototype project. That the idea was that we could show what an attempt at a carbon neutral, zero car building that focused on affordability and community could be, and that it could be successful, and that ideally we could share it with the open market and inspire developers to kind of take that on. After 18 months of opening the building up to tours, it was seen as an aberration in the marketplace, not a future possibility. And so in late 2014, early 2015, we bought the site across the road and embarked on the first Nightingale project with the help of, you know, 6 other Melbourne architects. And shortly after that, we assembled Nightingale Housing. The fundamental goal of the Commons and of Nightingale Housing was to think of ourselves as architects and designers, but not just looking at the built form, but looking at a broken system, a broken housing system. And what we thought we needed to do was design a new system. So not just about an architecture of reductionism, but about housing delivery of reductionism. So taking out the real estate agents, taking out, you know, the finance brokers, all the people, all the middle men and all their cuts, taking out the taking out the car parking was harder than we thought. And then focusing on, you know, building residence community. I think the interesting thing for us at Nightingale was that in taking all of these things out and reducing the cost of capital and reducing profitability and focusing on community, what we still found was that Nightingale 1 was 19% under market, but it's still too expensive, still not accessible to many, many Australians. And so, you know, our decision to deliver 20% affordable housing or social housing with Housing Choices Australia and Women's Property Initiatives in all future Nightingale projects was kind of a key move for us. And the other big thing was looking at cross-subsidy within Nightingale. So we sell big apartments on the top levels and we make them quite expensive. And they cross-subsidise our very small apartments, you know, on the lower levels, like our tile house apartments in Preston. And so that they become, you know, the accessible sales point for someone to get into the housing market. So we have $215,000 tile house apartments in the village, for example. Anyway, thanks heaps, Andrew. Great panel.
Thank you. So our last contributions, could I invite Kerstin Thompson and Toby Pond?
Toby.
Thanks, Andrew. I might just start by saying that, yeah, I'm Toby from KTA, Senior Associate at KTA, and we, as Thomas mentioned, have been working across a number of Homes Victoria sites collaboratively over the last 6 months. I think at last count, I think we might have had some detailed thinking on close to 1,000 apartments in the last 6 months for Homes Vic sites across Melbourne. We've also worked across PHRP bids, and KTA as a practice has always been interested in housing in all its forms. So single houses, multiple housing, and market, affordable and social housing. So that's our focus today. And I think my role in today's panel is really to sort of talk about the other end of the spectrum, to perhaps what Angie's talking about in terms of the aspirations of the kind of goal setting that can inform the projects that we deliver. At the moment, we're sort of right in the cut and thrust of trying to work in Richmond in particular under Wave 2, which is 144 homes on the existing housing estate there. And we're right in the thick of design development on that one. So happy to reflect on some of the challenges and factors that are influencing the development of that project. Kerstin.
Thank you, Toby. Hi, Kerstin Thompson from Kerstin Thompson Architects. Look, I'll just cut to the chase, actually. Toby's touched on some of the challenges that we're working through, and so I just thought I'd quickly give us 6 propositions, which I think have some of the tensions that we're finding in social housing, some of which are common to multi-res anyway, but some very specific to this project in Richmond and to social housing more generally. Noting that this is a project not just for the delivery of many new homes, but for urban renewal and the Home Victoria's expectation for transformational change through a project like this. So high levels of dwelling amenity as well as community and neighbourhood contribution, mutual benefit, if you like. So I'll just cut to the conundrums. Design for all or design for no one. One of the things we're finding when you don't know your end users, of course, is the default to a generic and, if you like, repeat types. What also makes this interesting compared to private sort of housing is that there is not market choice, if you like, but rather allocation of dwelling. So that raises some interesting questions about design for all or no one. Second one is the question around architectural neutrality, and is that even possible or appropriate in multicultural Melbourne? The sort of tendency perhaps to need to play things safe with a sort of neutral architectural language, but are there blind spots in that? Are we sort of really operating from a very particular architectural training, maybe with a sort of Euro or Anglo-urbanism focus as a default, and are there problems with that? So what does it mean to be truly culturally responsive in architecture in a multicultural context? And I'd say that's not just about style, that's also about spatial practices too. Romance of the Commons, for whom? That's number 3. I think it's really interesting, and I noticed in the chat there was a question about laundries, and that was one of our examples we had, that we have found in social housing the desire for individual, your own laundry, where you can control it. And the interesting thing we're seeing is some of the private sector housing, a desire for common laundries as a place of exchange and sociability. So there's very different understandings of the merits of those spaces for different purposes, depending on the cohort. For regulatory formulas, what of site and contextual responsiveness and innovation? Look, many of you will know I rail sometimes against the compliance standards like BADS, for instance, and the limitations they can place on typology and innovation in that, and the diversity of housing choices. So, and the sort of potential for extra over or the anomaly, how we deal with that. Number 5, beyond the necessary, what makes for homeliness? Ideas about generosity and maximum. Lacaton Vasal's thinking, I think, in this regard is really interesting in their talk about bonus spaces. Here, certainly area is associated with value and money, so it's very hard to argue or advocate for extra space. So how are the other ways we might be generous? Conversations around free elements, the agency of occupants to adapt their space, to impart a sense of care and the sorts of quality of spaces, especially common areas, degree of intimacy and warmth, which we're looking for. And I think in the COVID situation, how we have a language of warmth and materiality that feels like home rather than institution is a really, really tricky one. The wipeable surface, the maintainable material plays all sorts of havoc with this. I don't know how some of those projects in the UK that we see of, say, Peter Barber architects and things get through. Honestly, it's a different world, as we argue for a brick snap. And of course, stringent use of public monies that goes with that. So interesting question. And finally, 6th conundrum, repetition for efficiency and for equity, wherein lies character or the points for attachment for occupants. So there's a tension between construction efficiency and urban character, between a quantity surveyor's fear of variety and the planner's fear of the repeat, which we're currently wrestling with. You know, the repeat of elements, stacks of types and services, and the sort of lament that we get from councils about that, of uniformity. So questions around architectural articulation comes into play. I think we all know that word and what that means. So it does make us in-house wrestle with, you know, where does character and come from in architecture? Is it through its use and the way in which it's appropriate and adopted by its people, or is it through the architecture as some kind of armature for that? Some of the questions that we are wrestling with. So look, to sort of finish up, we really just table these as some potential fodder for today's conversation. We know many of you have already wrestled with this stuff, and then none of this is new to you. Some of it's perhaps a little bit new to us, and we're looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Kerstin. And if we could just have everyone up on the screen now, so we can start a conversation. So hopefully that's given our audience a bit of an overview of who's sitting in front of them right now. There was a mention, Kerstin mentioned the questions. I've neglected to mention that, yes, of course, there are questions that will be accepted. There's a lot of subject to get through in the next hour and a half and a lot of speakers, so I guess we'll see how well we go with including the questions, but we will try and have a little bit of time to do so. I have to say, I'm starting with saying I'm tremendously excited that of my list of subjects that I want to cover, there's at least 4 or 5 of them that are in your 6 conundrums, Kerstin. I'm feeling like I'm reasonably on the mark here, which is good. I wanted to start this conversation off maybe appropriately, given the context of the last couple of days and the kind of conversations that we've been having. I wanted to start with people and designing for people, and start this as a really open question for anyone, really. And I like this phrase that you've kicked off with, Kerstin, which is designing for all or designing for no one. Who are we designing for? You know, there have been so many reports over the years, so much research on changing domestic environments and on all sorts of conditions that are changing how we use and aspire to our homes. We have changing family units and blended families. We've got growing single-person homes. We've got changing work attitudes, greater mobility. We're clearly not designing for the post-nuclear family, but our volume builders continue to supply almost entirely close to this model. So I guess to kick things off, I wanted to just pick everyone's brains as to why is that? Why is it that we are still designing, at least at the volume scale, not the people in front of me now, but at the kind of the large scale of housing? Why are we still stuck so much in this really one-size-fits-all family unit for housing? And what might be some of the keys as to how we can change that? That's an open question. Who wants to jump in as the first person in this session to say something? Jeremy.
Yeah, you know, we build at our city's edges because it's cheaper. It's ununionized labour. The land is cheap. It's often land banked and rezoned. So there's a economic imperative to why, as a developer, you would build out there. And then there's a target market that people look at, which is aspirational Australians looking for a home and all of the things that they see that everyone else has. And so that aspirational Australian that they're marketing to, you know, wants the ability to park 2 cars in a garage out the front and have a rumpus room and a living room and an alfresco dining room. And I think the last part, which is the problem that, you know, I think a lot of us here have struggled with, is the trouble with economic legacy. So when you're trying to deliver an innovative housing model, which is why Emma Holmes, you know, the work that you're doing now is so important, because you get the ability to break that economic cycle. When we tried to build the Commons, you know, 5 of the apartments nearly couldn't settle because the banks didn't understand the value of an apartment with the higher thermal efficiency but no air conditioning, or a shared laundry, not an individual laundry, you know. So, you know, the valuers couldn't understand that. The banks didn't understand that. So I think that the status quo, you know, reigns supreme. And when you want to be a property developer, which is a very risky proposition, you don't want to innovate. You want to deal with as many risks as you can. And so the importance of something like, you know, the IBA, or, you know, the proposition that Homes Vic are pushing, or whether it's Assemble or Nightingale or property initiatives, the ability of those projects to innovate helps the rest of the market shift.
Okay, so I think I did want to talk about demonstration projects in a moment, but just to stick with this question around the other forces that kind of like essentially provide this default. I guess one question, Sophie, I was interested with your projects. Some of your projects are quite tailored both to location and to the client's needs. They're often working with challenging budgets. What's your approach to identifying specific needs? And then I suppose most crucially, designing in a manner that builds resilience into the inevitable kind of value management period that where often tailored kind of design elements get stripped out. How do you build resilience in that sense?
I think, well, we've got a number of years under our belt now, so fortunately we don't get much stripped out, because I think we make some critical choices initially about where we will, as we describe them, moments of luxury, and they will be just small moments of luxury with the highest impact that we can find. In terms of the clients and I guess being responsive to the client groups, we somewhere sit in between designing for all and designing to no one at one spectrum, and a very customised, bespoke individual home at the other. If we're working with Aboriginal Housing Victoria, women's property initiatives, for example, we very specifically make design decisions based on their sort of cohort. So we can't design for a tenant, because neither organisations don't know who's going to move in at the time. But we can make some design decisions about a cohort. And some of the community housing providers we work with provide really good design guidelines that also help as a way in to that. And then when a project's finished, I guess the important thing is residents are given a choice. So they're shown these homes, and they get to decide whether they want to live there or not, if it's going to suit their needs or not. But yeah, we make critical decisions at the very start of the project so that stuff isn't getting pulled out, and the big decisions we make cost very little money, like spatial arrangements and borrowed landscape views and things, passive design elements that we can do that don't cost the earth.
Yeah. I've just noticed in some of your previous talks, you used the phrase little moments of luxury, which I thought was really quite poignant, because it might only be a lampshade or a strip of timber, but it's those kind of things that differentiate it from something that's produced necessarily 1,000 times in a row and don't have those moments, I suppose.
Andrew, can I add something to that as well, if possible? I think another thing, as culturally we are incredibly bad at, is briefing, and we rely on value management after the design is prepared rather than robust cost planning and briefing from the outset. So we need to acknowledge that's an incredibly bad legacy of our strata sector, where you lob something into planning, hope it sticks, and then rip its guts out later. I don't believe developers do that maliciously. I think they do that because they don't understand how that value can be spent up front. So I think that's one really important point. The other is we have a risk-based procurement model. We draw the building up, we go to a builder, we ask them to take all the innovation and price the risk into their project. And we have this issue where we're not able to partner with builders in an ongoing way. I mean, Utzon said it the best on the Opera House when his, famously the quote came back horribly under from a builder who didn't understand the project. But we don't have a culture of building prototypes and supply chain solutions. The Housing Commission of Victoria is the best that has ever existed in this state. Of that complete supply chain control. You read their innovation documents that come out from the command of their precast and post-tensioning systems at the Holmes Glen tank factory. This is a really big problem, from cost planning through to brief, through to design, and then partnering in more innovative ways with the building industry to see corporate memory and lessons pushed forward into projects. Right now, we're reinventing the wheel on every project. It's ridiculous.
I think this might be useful crikey. So this will be popping up from time to time, and I have to say, I'm not sure how we'll be doing in an hour's time, because I think we might need 4 of these, but I'm going to have lots of faith that it can be shrunk as might need be as we go through this. Look, I think if I could just pick up on the first of your points there, Andy, around proper briefing. There is something that might be interesting to talk about in relation to build to rent, and I might pull Thomas in at this point because you guys are looking at this. But certainly, the question of quality of brief often kind of spins on what the person writing the brief wants the project to do. And if they want the project to sell pictures, it's probably different than what they want the project to do if they're going to hold on to it for 25 or 50 years. And so you probably are more invested. And in fact, you were definitely more invested. Thomas, could you talk a little bit around the growth of build to rent in the environment, and whether indeed there might be an opportunity for this growing sector to shift the market a little bit in terms of the quality of briefing, which then produces a better quality of design potentially?
Oh, definitely, Andrew. I think that the key thing you notice from the inside out is that build to rent, like social housing, like affordable housing, is more interested in the long-term quality and resilience, and less focusing on the gloss and the aspiration. So ultimately, it's a more expensive building, but it's designed to last longer. It's designed to be a maintained asset. So there's public money or institutional money being spent on it. So there's a lot of actually benefits to the end user in terms of the quality of the apartment you get. And as we experienced when Assemble was setting up, that it is actually very hard, and how to get these sort of the right pricing and the right level of quality, but also remain enough of that sort of moments of luxury and sort of being able to essentially market and the, I guess, the market within Australia is sort of quite new to this concept of a high-grade rental building, so it was quite a strange thing to get our heads around. Besides like basic things like services and finishes, the one thing that we came out of it was just simple things like how air conditioning and car parking were treated in a much better way. For instance, the Assemble has really pushed things like having no air conditioning condensers on balconies. It's more combined systems. And what we're noticing is a huge crossover to the social housing sector, that the Homes Victoria briefs are very, very similar in a way. They talk a lot about the resilience, but also about how systems and like mechanics and things work, which is, I know, something that Nightingale also looked at as a way of getting most bang for your buck within the building, putting the money in the right place. That really gives that benefit back to the individual occupant. So the briefing is far more complex. It's much more considering a feasibility of the operational expenditure, which is usually something that the build-to-sell developer doesn't really care that much about. They will just pass it on to a body corporate, and it's their problem. So this idea of creating a building that's an asset that's maintained, and also at the same time designing the program or the community. It's more of the, not just the physical building, it's the, I know Assemble and Nightingale put a lot of effort into that idea of how the building will be programmed, and how the sort of social constructs will maintain the quality of the community within the building, which is actually something moving towards what, you know, an institution like a public institution like Homes Victoria would do. So there's a lot more, besides the individual briefing of the physical apartment size and materials, it's also about how the community will operate. And there's been a lot of work, especially with Assemble lately, about how we get communities working at a larger scale. So that's been a unique thing which we've seen also mirrored in the social housing work lately with Homes Victoria.
Yeah.
Can I just answer that, Thomas? Yeah. I think Tom and I worked on a couple of projects together over the last sort of couple of years, and I think one conversation I was really struck by on a public housing renewal project recently was in that project, the consortia were responsible for both building and then holding and operating and maintaining the buildings for 45 years, and then had to hand them back to the government at the end of that period of time. The conversations that simple metric spurred with the designer consultant team was really fascinating, because suddenly they were looking at not just building it and handing it over and forgetting about it, but actually what was going to cost them to look after it over the 45-year period. And that really changed their thinking about the sort of systems and materials and planning that went into the building. So I think that short-term thinking is really, I think Jeremy touched on this as well, the kind of short-term, let's just build it and sell it and move on, is at the core of what's wrong with our industry. And as soon as you require someone to be responsible for it into the future, suddenly they want to pay a bit more for their air conditioning system up front, because it's going to save them money over time. They're going to pay a bit more for resilient materials because they don't have to fix them. So I think that's really important.
So I guess that's probably a very good moment to bring Emma into this conversation, because of course the elephant in the room is the billions of dollars being spent by the Victorian government on some long-term investments that they will maintain responsibility for. I mean, I guess, you know, one of the dangers of past large housing initiatives has been a tendency towards one size fits all, the inevitable kind of tendency where when delivering not hundreds but thousands of homes is to move towards kind of ruthless repeatability. So does Homes Victoria have a strategy to counter this, to ensure that there is diversity and adaptability and the opportunity to meet different needs, kind of to reflect this conversation so far?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. I think I would sort of start by saying that I guess we're delivering in a lot of different contexts, and each of those contexts have their complexity, site constraints, site opportunities, etc. So that's factoring into how we, I guess, break the repetition and the sort of the standard. Having said that, and I think it goes back to what Kerstin was talking about, and all the things you said resonate, Kerstin, very, very fully with me. I mean, we have to deliver commercially. I mean, at the end of the day, we have funds where we want to build a lot of homes for people across the state who need them. So we're always looking at that opportunity to optimise land, first of all, make sure the land's well located close to amenity, and then really looking at how we can be delivering really spatially homes with very high spatial quality, great natural light, rooms that allow, well-proportioned rooms that allow a degree of flexibility in them so people can live their lives in different ways, because it's responding to different groups of people and their different needs, whether that be family models or single people. So all of these things play out, but we also need to be really respectful of context. And I think that, again, goes to Kerstin's points about how we fit well within a neighbourhood context. There's going to be a level of standardisation in what we're doing, but then in how things fall out on site and how that manages through is where we're going to get that diversity. I mean, we're looking at sites of, you know, small sites with our asset renewal programs to major transformational projects on our estates. So they're going to need very, very different approaches. And at the heart of that is how we can get design innovation within that and design thinking from the outset, from the briefing, Andy, to your point, right through to how we innovate and creative in our commercial delivery models. And that's something that we're looking at very fully as well within our portfolio, is how we can deliver commercially and sustainably, knowing that we will hold this stock for a very long time, or our partners through the community housing agencies will hold and manage this stock for a very long time. So, you know, it's a very complex and ambitious program, and we are, you know, we're building at the capacity and capability of our team at Homes Victoria, both in the early stage master planning, and we've got a very strong delivery arm of the organisation. But we're also learning as we go, drawing from lessons of the past, but also really seeking to partner very fully with many of the people in this room and many more architectural and landscape architecture practices to really try to innovate within that context.
So in a moment, I'm going to throw to Jeremy to talk to the very heated discussion around laundry and rooftop laundries that we may need to have, which does link in, I think, to very important issues of management regimes and kind of how you maintain maintenance regimes, which is actually super important. But also before that, Kerstin, since this first question was kind of somewhat aligned with your first point, which is who you're designing for, do you have any thoughts so far about our conversation in terms of some of the comments that have been made?
I think, look. I think you sort of touched on those, but and even in answer to your very first question, actually, Andrew, why is there still this kind of status quo of housing type being rolled out? And you know, I think part of it is just because options like higher density apartments just haven't been good enough to make the case for denser living as a viable option. And frankly, COVID and that experience has, in some ways, a bit like public transport use, has kind of set us back a bit, where we were making gains in showing the opportunities and benefits of more collective or closer living, with a retreat to the detached house as a kind of safer option, especially when you're in lockdown. So I think some of that is going to be quite impactful on what it means to be delivering these buildings now. I think it's a really interesting one, just the breadth of diversity in any of these buildings that we're working on right now, and the attention to that and how you do that. And I would say that probably our tendency in KTA, for instance, does tend towards, if you like, a slight abstraction or leanness in the building that can be appropriated and adapted for a wide range of users. And that is probably where I think things like BADs are too prescriptive in this being a bedroom, this being that, and therefore prescriptive of the household type. So models of planning types that do enable, you know, a big share cohort household as opposed to family traditional ones is really important. And that's the sort of innovation we'd like to be able to see more of, to be more responsive to more household types. I don't know if I answered your question, sorry.
With a couple of more questions, which is useful. I think so. I did want to kind of move on to this kind of question around maintenance regimes and also shared spaces and how they are managed and how they're designed and how they are how they meet the needs for the residents. And it's probably applies to any one of you guys that have been having to work with this. Sorry, Kerstin?
Oh, no, I was just going to say on that too, I know the laundry discussion has been mentioned already, but just as another example of that, and again, this is the Richmond project at the moment, you know, the idea of offering a sort of generous perimeter to the building with an undercover space for community gatherings is really problematic where there is a major drug issue in this area. So suddenly the things that might work in Brunswick with a very specific demographic are very problematic and in fact discouraged. So that's another example of this thing of governance cohort and how we respond to that and still produce places that people care about and want to be in. So
I suppose there's a few things embroiled here, just to pull it apart a little bit. There's on the one hand, there's the morphology of a building where it may or may not allow for shared use that works. So the idea of putting something on a roof is different, like particularly hanging laundry out or whatever, is different than the strictures that are often in place for apartments where you can't do that on the balcony. And then the other, I guess, issue is more generally around how you ensure there's a sense of safety amongst all tenants when they're not in control of that space. And particularly when you're investing in a communal space, how they feel safe in that kind of environment. Jeremy, could you talk a little bit around, because obviously Nightingale 1 was one of the first projects that sort of quite deliberately, explicitly talked about shared use of facilities as a part of building community. How is that working? What have you learned in the years? Is that changing in the way you do that?
Yeah, look, I mean, to Kerstin's point, Nightingale 1 is a massive success, but it's 99% white. You know, of the 39 residents that moved in, 38 were tertiary educated. You know, of the 39 residents that moved in, 7 of them were architects or graduate architects. It was a very specific cohort, and who all came on a long journey, you know, with us around education about what to expect from Nightingale and what Nightingale expects from you. So they kind of entered into a you know, social contract that they were going to move in, that there was an expectation that they would be part of a community and that they would have certain responsibilities under that community. I think the failure of you know, social housing across the globe, you know, is when you get the poorest people in our society, you know, the most needy people in our society, and you put them all into one place, it is bound to fail. Like, I think that, you know, the mixed tenure model has to be, you know, a civilized society's way to deal with housing equitably. You know, so I think, you know, you know, and we see it in London, you know, we see it in New York, you know, and, you know, ideally, you know, I know, Emma, when you were at the City of Melbourne, you know, you were trying to push through planning amendments that inclusionary zoning would sit through, you know, every aspect of our society. So it becomes a responsibility for every housing development to do its part to house the 116,000 people who are currently experiencing homelessness. So I think that the problems that Toby and Kerstin are facing is because, you know, the historic model of how the tenants are selected or chosen off the VHR, off the register, it's massively problematic. But, you know, can I go back to how I've seen it work? And to be totally honest, we haven't finished any of our 20% mixed tenure buildings yet. So Nightingale Ballarat and Nightingale Anstey are like 2 months away from completion, upon which, you know, Housing Choices and Women's Property Initiatives will be putting in their first round of tenants into those. And we've done lots of work with them about making sure that we're able to take their residents through the same kind of information sessions and education that the Nightingale residents that go through the information sessions go on. But, you know, look, and just to go back to the communal spaces through COVID, if you look at what happened between the Commons and Nightingale 1, which are across the street from each other during COVID, you know, on Wednesday nights during the first big lockdown, there was COVID concerts every Wednesday night. And someone would perform on the balcony of 102 and everyone would come out to their balconies and watch and applaud and dance from their balconies. And someone would go and roller skate on the street with the hula hoop, you know. In Nightingale, Brunswick East, there were fashion shows in the hallway with masking tape on the door threshold so none of the kids went over. They formed COVID bubbles level by level. They broke out the 2 rooftop spaces. So one group would use one rooftop space and one would use the other rooftop spaces. The rooftop spaces became key, particularly when the parks were closed for people with kids. So the Nightingale buildings were the only places where the kids could gather outside in the kind of their own kind of COVID bubbles in their own kind of landscaped areas. In Nightingale 1, that, you know, remember VCAT forced us to put 3 car spaces in there. Someone went there, you know, one of the parents drew a racetrack on the floor in there and it became, and then put up a disco light and that became a place for the kids to play. So there was one good thing that came out of that VCAT ruling. So, you know, I've seen it work incredibly well, but also the interesting thing about all the Nightingale apartments is that all of their circulation, and KTA, you probably like this, you know, like a lot of your buildings, they have they have external circulation to their apartments. So, you know, they're not, you know, hermetically sealed things, you know, they're naturally.
I'd be really interested to understand Michael's views on this as well, because obviously we're talking about this dynamic of, you know, perhaps more privileged housing with a clear social contract and a choice versus the type of environments. And obviously, Michael, you've designed other projects like One Santa Fe and a very different type of cohort. I'm interested in your experience of those different cohorts in communal space.
We've worked on, as you mentioned, a wide range of housing projects, from more what we would call market rate housing to supportive housing for homeless individuals. The thing that I continue to find is that the difference has to do with a great deal to do with how we define what our ambitions are for housing. And that sounds very general, but if just listening to the conversation so far, many of the issues really resonate with the experiences that we have, because housing is actually very specific. It's very particular. It's complex, and there really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to any of these. I think to any of these problems. When I said when I mentioned it has a lot to do with the way that we define the problem, I think it has to do with how we think of housing culturally. We have worked with developers who believe housing is a product, and they talk about it as a product. They never mention housing. They only refer to it as the thing that is for sale, in a sense, as and has economic value. And that's, of course, important, and that's probably the largest portion of housing in the marketplace. But that's very different than having the ambition to make community, to make home. And the reason that I think has such importance is it has a direct result on how much innovation as architects and developers you can bring to a project. If the goal is to define what it is that you're making as primarily product again, innovation isn't terribly important at that point. But if your ambition, your goal, your mandate, your responsibility is to take on how you make housing, which is extremely appropriate to the particular cultures and communities that it's going to serve, then innovation is probably at the very top of very key top of the list, because you automatically can't take a cookie cutter approach to what it is that you're making. And I think that maybe overly simplistic binary equation does translate to things like material and material choices, and it does have an effect on the long-term maintenance and sustainability of the project because of the choices that you make. I'll make one small example. I worked in a previous life before I started my own practice for another firm, and we were doing housing in Germany, and all of the subsidies for that project were upfront subsidies. The money was all upfront. It went to the building of the building. There was virtually no money for the long-term maintenance or operations of the building. And that meant that automatically the choices you made in terms of materials, longevity, were things that were extremely important because the buildings had to last a long time. They had to have a quality that sustained itself over time. In the US, often what we see in a lot of the supportive, affordable housing is that subsidies come in at the end in the form of rent subsidies, and there's virtually no money to build the buildings. Those developers are scraping to try to cobble together money to build the buildings. It inevitably means that the buildings are built extremely inexpensively, very cheaply, and they have significant long-term costs to them. But that's in fact where the money is as you continue to patch the buildings together. I think these mechanisms, and again, how we define how housing relates culturally, socially, what our ambitions are really driving so many of these things that we're all talking about today. And I don't mean to zoom too far back out and take it out of the specific, but in a lot of ways, I think it is, at least I've found that it's very much the context of how we're navigating through the questions of how housing relates to society and culture now.
Thanks, Michael. And I appreciate that you probably have to zoom off any minute now. You're almost out.
That's right. Those are my final words. I'm sorry to again zoom that out a little bit too much.
It was very interesting, that commentary, and also I guess just reflecting on earlier, you're talking about how doing some of the buildings you're doing and how there's this kind of backlash around why are we building such wonderful buildings for poor people, and that the position that puts you in terms of not only the build cost as you described, the very, very thin build cost, but then what that means for the regimes of management of the thing, because as we know that open public space is always the bit that's the ongoing stuff that people worry about, and plants and trees and whatever else you have to deal with, and so it's a really challenging thing, particularly under the specter of pruit ego and the whole conversation around architecture's failure of what in fact was really a kind of a maintenance and political and policy failure. And it's really interesting to see today still being able to build the buildings that you're doing, despite that kind of nonsense narrative that evolved in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. And that really does get back, I think, to the question of what role is housing continuing to play in defining our cities and our cultures. And my sense is that housing is actually going to be, I'm sure it is the same with everybody on this panel, is going to be the typology, is going to be the building form, which has more of an effect on our cities in the next 20 or 30 years than almost any other typology. In the past, it was probably commercial office buildings defining skylines. It was infrastructure defining mobility and access in the suburbs. But housing is really the fundamental question going forward.
Sure.
I'll leave it at that. I do have to go. Appreciate it's your. I feel in familiar territory. You're all dealing with exactly the same thing. And I will say that in every project, the debate about laundries is always almost the top of the list, but that's a whole other lecture.
And car parking.
Before you go, Kerstin, I want to. Have you got one more minute before you go, Kerstin? Okay, right. Okay, Toby can fill in for you. That's fine. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kerstin, and we hope to see you again. So I guess that conversation, that the comments that Michael was making, did make me think that did make me wonder about the demonstration project in terms of, like, if we're looking ahead at the next 20, 30 years and how defining this the role of housing may be in our cities. And if we recognize that a lot of the way housing has been done and can continue to be done is pretty dysfunctional in many ways, it would seem to me that there is a really big important role for the demonstration project. But on the other hand, if you're as old as me, you'll probably have looked at a lot of housing initiatives that have been prototyped in the last few decades. And you might be a little bit jaded. So many have come and gone: future homes, green homes, affordable homes. Often they don't stick. Sadly, they often fill a few pages in the weekend papers, but they don't really manage to upscale. So I guess an open question to you is, what are the factors that you think that can translate a prototype into a model, and from a model into accepted practice? And conversely with that, what do you think the telltale signs are that a demonstration project is not likely to go anywhere? Can we just talk about demonstration projects for a moment?
I think there's perhaps a high price that comes with demonstration or prototyping or those types of projects that maybe we need to get right. Maybe there's not an uptake because of the cost associated with them initially, with all that innovation that goes into them. When you compare the square metre rate or the build cost to the status quo, I imagine they're often much higher. The ones that I've worked on certainly have been. So potentially that's one of the reasons that they're not picked up more often.
That wasn't our experience at the Commons, Soph. So the Commons was $7.1 million for 24 apartments and 4 retail spaces. Like, it was well under 300K, per apartment. And it's because we were taking stuff out, but we couldn't convince anyone to do it. So I think you can do both, but when it's a kind of a system change thing rather than a building change thing, I agree. Innovation in construction technology, it's massive cost impulse, but when it's a change around spatial planning or spatial reductionism or material reductionism, I think that's a different proposition.
Yeah.
Can I?
I'll go, Andy.
I was just going to say, look, I've just been writing the epilogue for the Merchant Builders book at the moment on exactly this question of the demonstration project and innovation in housing, looking at merchant builders. And having studied a number of programs, the Gen Y House by Development WA or Land Corp at the time in White Gum Valley as one, high-profile, successful piece of architecture didn't catalyse any change within the broader market. And then if you compare that to the ACT demonstration housing project that Leah Jury's team ran, this is an extraordinary example of looking at the role of government as not doer but enabler. And so under that model, the likes of an Assemble or a Nightingale could pitch an idea either with a site or without a site. A dedicated team from government would be put onto that project, and what I would describe as a sandbox environment was created. They would make a site-specific planning scheme amendment that doesn't have any precedent effect, so you can control the innovation within a plot and not have it impact adjacent lots, so it's safe. And it then allowed for innovation to occur in an environment with active facilitation. Melbourne did this with Postcode 3000 to a degree in terms of that facilitation and enabling role. This goes a step forward and uses the full apparatus of planning and government to enable private initiative. So I think some other examples like the No Bills house that Mirvac did in Jacks Road, Cheltenham is pretty extraordinary. The Harmony 9 house they did at Waverley Park. I think the problem is when government tries to go it alone. I think what we need to do is create more creative partnerships. You know, when the Dutch turn up in Australia to sell something, it's always striking that it's government and industry hand in hand working together to export these ideas. And I think we need to be more creative in how we leverage both. So the government assists in de-risking innovation for industry so that it can be taken up on a larger scale. It's critical.
Oh man, I'm so tired of going to design talks where it's just dominated by Dutch. Because there is this enormous government support, and you'll go to a local event and there'll be 3 Dutch people all flown over to talk about something innovative, and you think, this is why they're exporting to the world, obviously. Toby, you were going to say something there.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So to pick up your question about demonstration projects, we're actually doing one at the moment for Homes Victoria under a separate sort of project model in collaboration with Leanne Architects. They're an emerging practice and won competition to do this. And what's interesting about this is that it's trying to sort of jump the scale from, it's neither outer suburban sort of growth areas, nor is it inner city densification of existing estates. It's trying to set up a demonstrated model for how you might take, say, a 2-site block in the middle sort of ring of suburbia and develop that with, say, 10 or 12 units. And so that's where I think we're in design development on that one at the moment. What we're finding is, I think to exactly your point, Andrew, is that Andy, is that the planning assessment and the kind of the regulatory kind of environment that these demonstration projects have to operate in still have to work within sort of BAD's compliance and clause 5220 or 5230, wherever it might be. And so you're having conversations that are really inane when what you're trying to talk about is the kind of merits of infill housing and how it can really change the sort of the middle ring of Melbourne suburbs. And so, you know, I was in a meeting recently with the planners who were on the job, and I'm not going to name them, but they were more interested in whether or not we painted the bottom half a different colour to create articulation than whether the space were really robust and going to last.
And just painted in mirrored paint, Toby, so you can't see it.
Exactly. And so I think, you know, when you said let's create a sandbox environment where, you know, where whatever's decided on the site doesn't necessarily have to set a precedent is really, really great, because you can see the fear coming through from the planning side that if we let this through, what does that mean for the next guy and the next guy? But I suppose our argument is what we're trying to propose is actually good and should be adopted, because if we try and live within a res code envelope, that's not anybody's idea of a utopia.
Can I jump in as a staunch defender of BADs in here? Like, can we just reflect on how bad things were 6 years ago in the city? They were dire. So I think it's really important to separate what I would call fear-based planning envelope controls, which deal with this exterior perception, subjective of the envelope, versus the performance and minimum standards of a home. Every sophisticated society has basic standards that govern spatial requirements. So I think it's really important, just to be fair and even-handed, that BADS has done wonderful things for this state that we wouldn't have had otherwise. It's leveraged degrees. In fact, I think it needs to go further. What I think needs to reform are the other planning controls that are getting in the way. We don't have effective density controls that give us flexibility on siting. And we have punitive, shrink-wrapped planning controls that dictate our external envelope and penalise us for generosity. I think I'd rather focus the attack on that.
No, I agree.
Except in the city of Melbourne's, sorry, I was just going to say, except in the city of Melbourne's West Melbourne structure plan, Andy, with clear floor area ratios.
Which the state has sat on for 2 years and won't approve.
So I think there's a question around density that I would like to get on in a minute, but I wanted to just pull Thomas in for a second, because we're talking about prototyping, you might say, and earlier, Andy, you talked about systems rather than product, and I'm interested in Nightingale Village as a prototype of how you deliver a project, because there were a number of different practices involved in that process. And it took quite a bit, I think, to probably pull that together. I guess the question is really at the tip of the iceberg around the profession and how geared up the profession is to actually innovate, not necessarily so much entirely with material and construction and kind of formal sense, but in terms of actually how it practices and how it works together and collaborates. Could you just reflect a little bit on the experience of Nightingale Village and how that's worked?
To start with, Andrew, unfortunately, you asked me the question about Nightingale Village, which I don't have that much personal involvement in. I do know it generally. So I think the general, idea was we were working with a series of architects, and we had to get some level of simplicity to the overall design to better develop the diversity, essentially, of 6 buildings together at one time and work with one builder. So there's a lot of work in that, which I'm sure Jeremy would probably know a lot more about. But a lot of the ideas about working with a sort of a mid to upper end builder was really what was, they wanted a single point of contact, which was what we've passed on. A lot of that is some of the work we've been doing with, sorry, I had to transition to some of the Assemble and Homes Victoria work, because obviously we've been working with KTA on projects for both of those clients. So we've been looking at a series of precinct projects. One, obviously with Andy, that we're doing at the moment, which is a series of buildings. And we sort of master planned the scheme together, and then we sort of allocated buildings over a shared podium. And so there was a shared vision, and of course Andy, with his skills, helping to drive the organisation of the urban design quite thoroughly. But then we've kind of allocated buildings within that. But then there's still an efficiency with the briefing about sort of the logic of the buildability of it, with in terms of maintaining facade types and balcony types and some of that, and bathroom types. We can get in some level of consistency, but at the same time trying to avoid the sort of 1960s social housing of having this over prefabricated, over uniformed, like this extreme end of prefabricated nothingness. The sort of how do you get that level of customization, normalization, and sort of contextual relevance to a project. So we've taken a lot of those learnings that KTA and Hayball have been doing with Assemble, and we've been working together with KTA with Homes Victoria on a similar concept. And it's really been, because our projects have been quite large scale, it's how to not build 1960s towers that are repeated and tall and massive. It's how to normalize and descale and create a level of appropriateness to the context and a reduced scale, but then allowing enough of a backdrop for customization from the inhabitants at the same time. So I think that answers some of the questions there.
Yeah, it does. I think so. And I guess to broaden the scale, Emma, to pull you in, clearly in the question around procuring and briefing, that upstream stuff that Andy's mentioned, with the volume of what's being delivered, it's a question to you, I suppose, whether Homes Victoria has looked at that briefing and procurement's kind of period itself as a moment for innovation as well, and that particularly when one of the legacies of past big builds has been, if you look back at the BER, all those years ago, one of the criticisms it was leveled with was essentially the need to speedily get people going and get boots on the ground, essentially delivered projects into the hands of, you might call tried and tested, but also not very adventurous practices, and that process of getting things rolling was not very either efficient or good outcomes in some ways. So what has the kind of state learned, and how is the state approaching that question of, incorporating innovation from the very inset, rather than necessarily the sparkle dust that a designer will bring to a project once they've landed with the brief, but all that steps beforehand, understanding what the needs are, developing that into a brief, turn that into something that you then go and take to market. Has that been a focus of Homes Victoria?
Absolutely. And I guess, as I said previously, Andrew, we are really wanting to learn as we go. I mean, Government Architect obviously has put out a guide, Government a Smart Client, and that's very much looking at how the process around procurement and then keeping quality through a process right through to delivery and then through to maintenance, looking at the steps you can put in place there. I guess we'd also, at a sort of policy level, really been clear around the guidelines that we're seeking, both at a neighbourhood scale but also within the builds. So trying to be really reasonably ambitious within what we're trying to achieve in terms of sustainability, etc. Being really clear up front, that's the ambition. And then seeing that through. Government Architect is doing reviews of all of our master plans, and we're going to embed that process very fully as we go through, but also our projects. And then our partnering projects, so where we're funding projects, we're really seeking to ensure that anything of scale, so anything over 100 dwellings or over 3 stories, is seen by the Office of Government Architect, to again keep that fresh eyes and critical friend approach to ensuring and supporting design through that process. I've through all my sort of stage of career been very fully of the belief that design is, the process and the expertise you bring to it is then how you get the outcome, and you've got to embed those things at every stage. I looked at a brief just yesterday that's about to go to market around a master plan, and we're really trying to embed within that, and also be an informed client at our end, embed within that the design expertise we're expecting to bring, but also being clear around our expectations. So hopefully, and I think, you'll be starting to see some things come out of the ground soon that have been driven by really good design decisions from the outset. We'll see how it all unfolds.
And I kind of recognise that the coin is there's 2 sides to this coin, which is the demand side. But if we look for a moment on the kind of the supply side, you might say the profession. I'm interested to just shift the conversation for a moment to that, and maybe Sophie, I'd like to throw to you insofar as clearly your practice is built on a commitment to the kind of social benefits of a project and the social qualities that come with a project. And sometimes in the last little while, you look at projects and you think that really hasn't been thought about very much at all. In fact, you'd almost say that that's a bit of a lonely field, being an architect for whom you really are front-ending the social benefits of the project more so necessarily than some other factors. So is it from your perspective, what was your journey into that, and how would you reflect on the profession around you in terms of what maybe it needs to do to let's say maybe upskill a bit more in that regard?
So my journey it starts with my mum, who was a nurse. So I just grew up in an environment that made damn sure that I understood that everyone was equal and anyone that needed a hand up should get one. And then within architecture, I had the pleasure of working with Graham Gunn for a number of years, and his work with merchant builders was the next level on that, I guess. And in our practice, we decided to pursue social housing as well as private housing to diversify our offer. Give me another prompt, Andrew.
Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of, it's just really what I want to look at is the degree to which the, if all circumstances went away and the state was the great client that we want it to be, and it's seeming to be, and we have tools in terms of new construction technologies and materials, etc. What does the profession itself need to do, looking inwards at itself? What does it need to do to make sure it can actually fully take advantage of this opportunity?
The profession more broadly, I guess I'm seeing a bit of a change now with the injection of all this capital. There's a lot more architects and design practices involved in the particular side of things that we've been doing for a decade. And I would encourage all those architects and designers that are doing that now to expand beyond practice, and it's what we do, and I think it's incredibly important, is advocacy. So if we got to this point where everyone had a home and it was all equal and there's all these amazing construction methodologies and, you know, capital was flowing into housing constantly, we may not need advocacy, but I don't say that that's ever going to be a solution. And what this conference has opened my eye up to as well, that it's a global problem. I didn't realise how dire housing is around the globe. So I think to improve the situation for those that are most vulnerable, our role as architects is to expand beyond practice and looking for design solutions and innovation with individual projects, and is to get out there and educate as many people as possible on the needs of everyone in our society for the need for a home, and to start changing hearts and minds.
One of the interesting things, if I could through to you, Jeremy, one of the interesting things about Nightingale was this model essentially of a kind of licensed approach to delivering the project. And obviously with the introduction of that, a lot of architects got involved. And I'm interested to know from your perspective what the lessons are in the last few years of that idea of how you might scale something like that, scale up a license like that, where the successes are, where some of the kind of rough edges have been. Could you talk a little bit about that kind of process of engaging with the profession and bringing it along on that journey, and, you know, where the good times have been and maybe where some of the challenges have been?
Sure. I mean, look, the fundamental idea of Nightingale was that it would be open source, that, you know, that we recognise this problem. I couldn't agree more with you, Soph, that, you know, we can't just draw buildings, right? As a profession, we have to be part of the solution, and drawing buildings is not going to solve it. We need to find other ways to do that. Nightingale Housing was meant to be a way to do that. You know, the licensing model, and Andy, you know, you're on the original, you know, board that would help select, you know, or go through license applications. So the idea was that great architects would apply for a license. They would get a license. It would cost them $500. We would share the IP with them. They would go out and raise the equity required to run a job, and that they would run that project. And that, you know, if you think about Nightingale 2 by 6 degrees, you know, basically, you know, Breathe Architecture had a spreadsheet. You know, our graduate architect was running the spreadsheet for Nightingale, which was the list of people that wanted to buy it. And then when 6 degrees started, that spreadsheet was given to 6 degrees. That's how simple it was. And then we shared all the drawings and all of our knowledge, and our project architect, Fairly Batch from Nightingale 1, worked pretty closely with Rivka at Nightingale 2 to share everything that she knew with Rivka. And then ideally, then Rivka would go and share that with, you know, Austin Maynard for Nightingale 3. During that time, we issued 33 licenses over about, you know, a 4-year period across the country. And of those 33 licenses, you know, about 5 projects started, you know, and, you know, lots of people were trying to buy sites or running feasibilities. But when it came down to it, to actually, you know, sign the director's guarantee on the contract of sale on the $3 million site, you know, and then to go and source the debt from the bank, you know, again, you know, our system, the status quo is that unless you've got proven track record on delivery of housing, you know, the bank isn't going to lend you, you know, $7 million, you know, unless you've already got enough money to, when you sign the director's guarantee, the bank needs to be satisfied that they can come and reclaim your house, and that you personally will, you know, will pick up the tab if something goes horribly wrong with the project. And so, you know, where Nightingale failed was, you know, I failed to see the risk and the complexity, and that the actual gatekeeper were the banks, you know, to the success of Nightingale scaling. And for that, so the idea was that would happen, you know, exponentially. So Nightingale was meant to be a couple of people running a database with previous projects and then sharing that IP with future licensed projects. And then, we get to like Nightingale Brunswick East, 4 projects in, and then no new projects coming in. That was an experiment with a developer where we're like, we're not getting anyone starting a project. We'll do a hybrid where the developer funds the project, does the development management, project management. They take the financial risk, But there was a bunch of problems with that project. The restrictive caveat wasn't served on the residents. Nightingale Housing, had little ability to police that, through the licensing model, So, we end up, it becoming a more centralized model, taking some great, incredible architects who have a history in architecture and understand the problem. And they're now working as development managers and project managers. You think about the people on this conference who make, who've made incredible difference in the city. Emma comes from a landscape, background, a landscape design background. Andy comes from an architecture background, but they're both sitting in big organizations, controlling billions and billions of funds. So look, the thing for us now at Nightingale is that we've become, a much more centralized housing delivery model where we've got a director of finance who goes and gets the financing, gets that concessionally, and he handles all the banks and handles bank. We've got a delivery team so that we can say to the bank, this is the same team that delivered these last 4 projects. You can trust them to deliver on time and on budget. And then Nightingale now engages architects, like just like Assemble does, just like Lend Lease does. So, it's a bit of a failed model to be
would
totally
you
honest,
say?
Andrew.
Well, would you say that that had there been is this somewhat a reflection on the capacity within the profession to actually adapt to the model, insofar as you've had a crash course in economics and business out of the back of this? Like literally, does architecture courses need to offer an economics kind of module so that you can actually understand what sits under the bonnet?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the reason that I teach, Nightingale Night School at Melbourne University, the final semester, 5th year, and it's really boring, and it's just, financial feasibilities one after the other for 16 weeks.
Yeah.
And, it's to teach, graduate architects, the financials of how to run a project, and a bunch of those graduates have now gone off and are now working in development management and project management, because that's where they think they can have the most impact.
Yep. Yeah. So Andy, I want to pull you in there specifically because obviously you've mentioned already your interest in upstream services, and clearly there is a need here. And maybe just to reflect for a moment, back to the big building, the mass building program in England in the 50s and 60s when they were building 500,000 homes a year. It's remarkable to remember that at that time, at least 40% of the architecture profession were salaried public servants, and that they were all the way through local government, state government, federal, all the way through there. And that is partly what delivered the quality of, Alexandra Road and other really amazing kind of housing projects of the time. There's another kind of question around what does it take to try and bring back more capacity at that end, at the upstream end. So at the business case analysis, at the needs analysis, at the briefing stage, at the all the way through that first part. What does it take, do you think? Because I know you've been teaching on this and you've been looking at this for a long time.
It always feels like a plug for our event, Andrew. But I think it's incredibly important and something that just charting my own journey. It's been really interesting to understand the role of exposure to certain aspects of the business of urban development and where the true influence really lies, and the role of the designer in that. And I'd probably just to backtrack a little bit, I think, Jeremy, also the experience was your own personal risk for appetite is off the chart. Appetite for risk is off the chart. And I remember seeing you at breaking point at times when Nightingale 1 was going through VCAT. And I think that's not for everyone, but we need a martyr at the front row to sort of make it easier for others. So I think that's just one thing to reflect on. But in terms of what you're talking about, I think we are still training architects in a 1960s hero designer model. I think it's really broken. I know Alan, Rory Hyde, Mel Dodd and myself are talking about this on an ongoing basis about how do we skill architects in a range of things. Nightingale Night School is a great example. But why can't we get better at these multidisciplinary, bring in real estate and property and development students, just as we bring in urban planners and empower them with new skills in understanding the role. Like for a planner to not understand land economics when they graduate is astounding to me. It's the single most pertinent tool in influencing urban development is land value and how planning controls interrelate to it. So I think that we need to look at how we're educated and how we break beyond this kind of legally defined professional straitjacket. You look around the room, you look around the industry in Victoria, the more powerful people are forward slashers, are doing multiple tasks and taking on additional skills. So I think it starts at universities for sure. I think it then extends to a post-master's level ongoing professional education and the opportunities to be exposed to these ideas. Where's the equivalent of a New Architects Melbourne or a Loop or these other fantastic institutions that's talking particularly about these alternative career pathways that you can pursue as a designer? I think it's incredibly important to sort of nurture people who are coming out of that program. Yeah. So I think there's a specific shortage of these types of people. To come back to the public sector though, I think this is a very, not to harp on my favourite Hugh Stretton references, but that Victoria has a very long history of private initiative followed by the public sector, and that extends to the illegal settlement of our city by a bunch of sheep farmers from Tasmania, which was retroactively formalised by the Crown. There's always been a history of private initiative followed by the public sector, and in Stretton's word, talent has traditionally distributed itself unequally between those two disciplines. So the Housing Commission of Victoria was an exceptional example where that changed. Incredibly talented people, the likes of Graham Shaw and others, Fuchs, were engaged and empowered, and that corporate memory was retained within those organisations. I think Homes Victoria is an incredibly exciting opportunity to capture that. They've attracted a heck of a lot of talent already to that team, but the next trick will be retaining that talent, ensuring that they're able to have impact, and maintaining that corporate memory that allows a public institution to become powerful over time. And I think, we've got the starting part. Now we need to get that monitoring and sort of an ongoing lesson. So I haven't answered that in a very elegant way, but I think somewhere in there's about 6 bullet points that might be a chronology of what you just asked, Andrew.
I think right as we speak at the moment, Zara is trying to unpick that and turn that into an ideogram. Emma?
Can I just come in off the back of that? I mean, I would like to say that we have been really fortunate at Homes Victoria attracting great talent, because I think everyone wants to be part of a big investment in something that people can really, that aligns with a lot of people's values who work across the built environment professions and across planning, etc. And I would also say that there are a lot of designers in those, the procurement roles across government, across education, health, etc., that I'm consistently coming across, who come out of big architecture practices or landscape architecture practices going into the public agency area. And I'd also like to say that I encourage everyone to consider a public role, because it's extremely rewarding, and the impact you have is so broad. It does, you're in for the long haul. You have to learn the ways of government and the ways of industry. But it's just been extremely rewarding in the many roles I've had in public agency. And I have learned in every role, like at the moment, I've been at Homes Vic about 4.5 months. My brain hurts at the end of every day because I'm just I'm just, wow, okay, let's think about that. So it's just an extraordinary opportunity to just get a really diverse set of skills and work with excellent people. So that's a pitch.
Influence. I think the critical point is influence, Emma. That ability to influence beyond the individual project and reacting to the brief is so crucial. Yeah. I just wanted to give one little anecdote. So I taught a subject with Timothy Moore called Public Works last semester, which was exactly about exposing young students to alternative career pathways in the public sector. And we interviewed countless incredible people, including from Homes Victoria and New South Wales government, local councils, etc. And of 25 students in the first week, everyone except one said that in 5 years' time, they saw themselves in a small architecture offices designing nice houses. What a monumental waste of brain power to be producing that outcome. When we surveyed them at the end of 12 weeks, every single one of them had to draw a career pathway into the future of what they thought their career might be. All of them saw value at some point, if not the end goal, at working in a public sector role, and mapped out with great detail where they thought that would be. And even to the point where they saw, if I went into the public sector and worked for a couple of years and learned all these skills, I could be a more powerful advocate on the outside. And we need both. We need Jeremy pushing Emma and vice versa. We need people on both sides of the equation to be really effective. So I just wanted to use that little anecdote because I think it shows when you expose people to this, you know, if they're aware of their career options, they're going to be more willing to take them.
Totally. I think there's an opportunity for somebody to set up a little employment agency specifically for that, I'd say.
It might be called public practice.
We're kind of rapidly approaching the kind of the last furlong, you might say, amazingly enough, and all my questions I've only got through, I think, about 3. So I did want to, before we kind of like begin to kind of wind up, I did want to talk directly and expressly about affordability and have that conversation. And I guess you mentioned with Andy, I think you might have mentioned earlier the question around the middle suburbs, and I did want to kind of raise that question with you lot, particularly like, for instance, KTA has obviously done some amazing work out in the country, but they've done some amazing work in the city, and they've done a lot of amazing advocacy for density in the inner city or in the middle suburbs, etc. What lessons do you think KTA has kind of learned from the years of doing fairly small and sometimes infill and complex projects in places that otherwise are an absolute nightmare to try and change the context, and there's a lot of constraints over what you can do. So in that context of how do we break up in the middle suburbs, Toby, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the right response is that the complexities are really what makes the project richer. So you actually thrive off those. I think in terms of the sort of infill projects, what we're really needing is a kind of flexibility of an open-mindedness from both our clients and the future residents. I think the Napier Street project, for example, has different ways of living embedded into the planning of the scheme, and I think that's something that is probably the biggest difference for us when we sort of start to contemplate kind of market housing, infill developments versus sort of public, social, and portable housing. Is that I think Jeremy touched on this, is that there's a sense of opting into the kind of design thinking and spatial thinking that gets embedded in the plans and designs for these projects. So I think I'd love to think that people can see different ways of living in a home that might not necessarily mean that they need to have 3 bedrooms and a study and 2.5 bathrooms, because actually they'd be comfortable having a bit less or a different sort of space. And I think that for mine is the thing that we constantly bump into, is just having those conversations early and to try and shift the agenda from what people think they want and it's the rebriefing question, what actually will service their needs and aspirations. And I think that's really key, that you don't need the alfresco dining, to your point, Jeremy. You don't need a bunch of things which are typically on the table or on the menu for market housing if you design the spaces thoughtfully and sensitively. You really start to put yourselves in them and imagine how you're going to use those spaces, and that comes back to empathy. You need empathy to think about how people are going to live and use the homes that you're sort of imagining.
Thomas, obviously Hayball has a range of different clients, including some quite big institutional clients, etc. How does that kind of observation map onto the larger clients, where it's there's quite a large volume of housing being delivered, etc. If part of the key to this is to break open what the typology is and look at some of its components. Is that something that you're seeing an appetite for from the kind of the larger clients out there, or no?
Well, to pick the sort of largest client, yes, like Lend-Lease, for instance, is investing in public-private partnerships, and they've been taking all their skill and experience to work with the Victorian government and other governments through Australia. So yes, there's definitely an interest to it because of those large institutional builders and developers. The scale is actually appealing to them. So they bring some of those smarts across. And I think those type of clients as well are quite used to quite long design processes, which is also a benefit. So like Homes Victoria or Lend-Lease, they spend a lot of time thinking about the designs. They ultimately get often a better quality without having to spend more on the square metre rate of the construction. They think about it for a longer period of time. And I think that's been a lot of the success is a more considered, especially a precinctual design approach, thinking more about the spaces, the density, is the building actually is the density too great? Are the buildings too big on the site? Will that have an adverse effect on the whole quality of the community? And I know, for instance, Andy and I had a lot of discussions about this, where New South Wales and obviously what Jeremy was mentioning before about plot ratios, that the densities that are sort of limited in Sydney create a much sort of better environments between spaces. And we're noticing that sort of passing on into Homes Victoria, how they think of scale of building. They're thinking about not building much more than 6 and 8 stories. And there's a lot of efficiencies between better quality precincts and spaces between buildings and construction efficiencies. Building under 8 stories, for instance, there's massive construction cost benefits. There's union benefits, there's fire benefits, but they're actually better buildings. They're closer to the ground. They've got more contact with the ground. There's more opportunities for deep planting and the like. So this idea that Lend-Lease has been pushing for a while in some way, in some of their sort of medium density residential precincts, we're seeing echoed in public housing. The public housing is not building 1960s towers anymore. Like it's not even a thing. A lot of that sort of crossover. So I think Lend-Lease, for instance, is one particular client. I know Frasers and others. We've built, for instance, projects with Frasers and Burwood Brickworks, which is a very similar concept that has all those ideas of community sizes and structures, not too many apartments per lift core, smaller buildings, open corridors, all those kind of aspects, which are fundamentally, as I think actually Jeremy mentioned, sometimes quite often cheaper to build, but they're actually more inclusive of the community. Also better in COVID events, as we've found. So a lot of those learnings that Lend-Lease have built into some of their design codes have actually sort of filtering through into a lot of the work that we do. So yeah, there's been a lot of crossover, a lot of synergies between those sort of large scale apartment builders. I wouldn't say the volume house builders, but the more of the sophisticated apartment builders have been doing that for a long period of time, like the Mirvacs and the Frasers and the Lend-Leases of the world. They already knew a lot of these lessons, and we're seeing a lot of crossover at the moment. And I think Assemble's picked up all of those and taken it even further, a lot of their ideas. So it's a very interesting time between the public and private developers are actually doing something quite similar. The other point to know is, I think, as mentioned about, I think Sophie brought it up as well, about a whole lot more architects are getting involved in affordable and public housing. What we're actually seeing is the affordable and public housing is starting to look better than a lot of build-to-sale projects. And I think some of the benefits that they're building in slightly tougher sites and locations. So areas like, for instance, Preston and some of those areas are outer ring suburbs which weren't so attractive to build-to-sale apartment developers are now becoming more feasible under these new different models with NIFIC funding and the like. So we're getting better design in sort of, I guess, originally less desirable areas. So the responsibility of the architect's is having a much bigger impact than I would say sort of 5 years ago. So profession's doing our bit. So.
Yeah. Andrew, can I just chime in to the question before about affordability? To be abundantly clear, it is the role of civil society to house its people civilly. And this could all be solved. This could have been solved in the 2019 election, with a commitment to, scrapping negative gearing and capital gains tax exemptions.
Yeah.
We've got a property system as an asset class, as a way to avoid tax, rather than a housing system. So, you know, if that's
Yeah.
the system we have to play in, and we, I mean, and you do have to applaud, you know, NIFIC, the Morrison government for NIFIC and the funding that that's been providing, and that then looking at the NIFIC review and how that's going to look at, you know, bolstering NIFIC and the first home loan deposit scheme to help people access that. But, you know, this could all be solved, you know, and Andy, remember that project you talked to me about in Sweden, the Millions project, where they were building 100,000 dwellings a year. The plan was to build that every year for 10 years. So there's a way to solve this. You know, for us at Nightingale Housing, we're a not-for-profit housing provider, and we cannot build affordable housing. So no matter how hard we try, taking out the profit, cutting out the car park, taking out the second bathroom, taking out the laundries, an architecture of reductionism, and we cannot find a way to deliver housing that makes it accessible to all Australians to get into. We have to partner with women's property initiatives or housing choices to be able to do that. And then we have to build apartments that are 25 or 30 square metres and then cross-subsidise them, you know, by someone else to make it work. Like, it's, you know, and so if I just want to applaud you in your practice and what you've done. Your work in the Reynard Street project for women's property initiatives is incredible. It's compact, but it's also incredibly beautiful and engaging. Sophie's work for launch housing, 16 square metre housing Sophie built for launch housing on an old piece of Vic Road site. It's incredible, and people feeling incredibly proud to live there. So I think that as a profession, what can we do? I think that we don't have a good culture of pro bono work in the architecture profession. You know, consulting services do, professional services do, legal services do, but architects don't. And so one of the questions that came up from the audience is, what about architecture fees? And I think that architecture fees should be appropriately set to enable us enough hours to do our work. And so within that, I think that we need to charge the architecture fees that we need to do the work. And then we should set aside part of that as pro bono for this particular work until such time as the tax settings are set to solve the problem. And as a profession, we all need to allocate probably 20% of our work, like open work do, to projects of meaning and of community importance.
Interesting. Sophie, Jeremy just mentioned that project you did, the relocatable units for, I think it was 57 or something, project, small homes on some surplus land. That's, I think, about 3 years ago. What were the lessons you had from that, and is it possible essentially to do that again and again and again?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a pilot project, and Launch Housing were very keen to have it as a pilot project, and so were the state government agencies involved, like Vic Roads and the DHHS, to prove its viability. The construction costs were pretty competitive there for the units themselves. The biggest lesson I took away, and I talk about this as often as possible, was the site selection. So Ballarat Road was an incredibly complex road to work on. It's an arterial road. So in terms of delivering that type of product, those transportable dwellings, shutting down Ballarat Road and all the traffic management involved was excruciatingly high. And a lot of those sites had been abandoned for many years, and a lot of the servicing was not there anymore. We had like some requirements from council, again, working within this very constrained regulatory environment that we've sort of all touched on, but you know, we had legal points of discharge that we had to connect to 150 metres, you know, down the street, and bring all these services to sites that were just not there anymore. So, yeah, site selection would be incredible. And another thing I like to talk about too is if we could make a product like that autonomous, so have all the services within the building, you know, dealing with your grey water, your electricity, etc. Then when they do move, those costs are, there's a uplift or a downlift, however we describe it.
That was one of the, I guess, one of the things I really enjoyed about Michael's presentation earlier was the idea of how you use different land plots that would not typically be used, and how you can provide innovative design on land, which is essentially is lower value and not only still do design, but actually use the eccentricities or qualities of the site itself to produce a really interesting piece of architecture. So I think that is interesting, how the role of site selection and what the opportunities are there, maybe how that can be supported through planning and through regulation. I have to say we had I have about 7 other major subjects to go through, and we got 7 minutes left, so we're really stuffed here. I was going to talk about decarbonisation. I was going to talk about build to rent, about the role of guidelines, about quite a few things, not least of which the
we shouldn't have to talk about decarbonisation in 2021. Like,
well,
we cannot be plumbing gas into buildings now. We have to have a building that's set for net zero emissions by 2030. Otherwise, everyone's screwed, particularly those 116,000 people who don't have access to safe and secure housing. Totally.
I'm glad you did manage to say that, because it's something that has to be said, and that will be on the board in about 5 minutes. I have no doubt. I did, because of the whole broad-ranging nature of this, and I knew it'd be somewhat kind of spread around. I kind of wanted to finish with a question for each one of you, a short question, or at least a short answer, as a way of just kind of like pulling together a few things at the end before we finish off. And really, it's in terms of what design can do, because today is all about design, and you're all design professionals. In terms of what design can do and what the profession can do, what do you think would be at the top of your list of levers for change as it relates to future housing opportunities? Alan mentioned that term earlier, levers for change, and kind of cutting through all of that wider conversation. I'm just interested to know, if you were to talk about the low-hanging fruit, what would be at the top of your list for levers of change? It's an impossible kind of question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And I'm going to ask Toby to go first. Oh, I think you're on mute, Toby.
Sorry, apologies. I managed to almost get through this without doing that. I think mine's fairly broad in it. I think it's about, I would really love expectations to be higher. I think that what we encounter as designers when we are given a brief, and Andy's touched on this a lot, there's a lot of inbuilt expectations into that brief. And so we push as hard as we possibly can as designers to make the most of it. I would love if, and it's probably a question for you, Emma, is that the expectations that get built into those briefs are higher, that they demand more of us as architects, that they demand more of the housing that we build and the places we make. So that's probably mine. I think, there's I'll keep it there, because I think we can do more, but we also need to be able to, given the auspices, to do more.
Emma, maybe I'll throw to you next.
Great, thanks. So I would agree, be ambitious. But I also think to the models that we've talked about today as well, be collaborative and open to understanding all the things that go toward delivery of a project. Because I think Jeremy with Nightingale, assemble Andy, it's very much about how it all stacks up. And I think what designers bring to it, if we're able to speak the language of the financiers, if we're able to understand the commercial models underpinning housing, we can find that sweet spot of optimizing land, really great quality housing that fits well in the neighborhood, and just builds legacy. Without understanding that, we're always in a sort of vulnerable position. And so I think that it's just really that collaborative, open, creative approach to delivery with design at its heart.
Thanks very much. Thomas, what are your thoughts?
I feel that architects should have a bigger role in the planning process, and much like, comparing Victoria to New South Wales, they're mandated for apartment projects over 3 stories. I feel that, and the design competition culture they have in Sydney sort of pushes a lot more design and amenity quality in apartment buildings over 3 stories. So I think that architects getting more mandated, becoming more part of the process, will only improve the quality. So I feel that's the biggest single move that we could take.
Thanks, Thomas. Sophie, what are your thoughts?
Mine's going to be a really micro scale. So I think for changing the lives of the individuals that we are all in this for, really, at the end of the day, housing more people in need. We haven't raised the idea of the voice of lived experience. So I think that's a change that we can bring more into. We're doing post-occupancy research with XYX Lab at Monash. And I think more of that can happen, particularly with this idea of building for everyone or building for no one. If we can have more of this post-occupancy research done, then we can target better outcomes for individuals.
And indeed, post-occupancy was another item on my list that we didn't really get a chance to talk about. I'm glad we're ticking a few boxes along the way here. Jeremy, what do you think are the kind of at the top of the lists for levers of change?
With my architect hat on, size matters. You know, we've got some of the biggest housing in the world. We've got a climate crisis. We've got an affordability crisis. You know, and we've got a bad case of affluenza. So, you know, pocket living in London, you know, whether you love it or hate it, you know, it's an attempt to solve, you know, access to housing for people. And I think that we need to be looking at, you know, minimum sizes or smaller sizes. And so, you know, the 16 square metre project for launch housing, incredible. And the other thing, I think, as a profession, you know, again, I agree 100% with Soph that it has to be around advocacy, you know. And currently, you know, what is it? Architects designing 3% of houses, you know, in the country. The rest are done by, you know, draftspeople, you know, project developers, volume builders. You know, we have to be engaged in discussions at the city's edges. You know, we have to accept that if that's what's happening, architects need to be designing those homes and they need to be making them better. So, you know, I think that we can't just do, you know, beautiful houses on the cliffs, you know, overlooking the ocean. We have to be working on 97% of the housing, not 3% of the housing.
Totally. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that question about size matters, because Andy did text me before this session identifying with the case studies that were shown around how tight the grids were, so compared to what we have here. And it's quite amazing what can be done. Andy, you're last up before we go to this wonderful slide.
And totally bewildered with how to answer this, but I think an expanded conception of design is the starting point. We as an industry have a propensity to complain about why things aren't the way they were. I think we need to get much better, like all other industries, at evolving and expanding what we do so we can have influence in different ways. If that means not having the same fees on a design project, but redistributing our efforts into other areas. I look at the Fulcrum Agency as an example in Perth of a fantastic example of that, distributing your influence differently. But I think the critical thing for us is we need to find a way in Victoria, and I say Victoria because other states do it better, we need to find a way to create an enabling environment for innovation in housing. And that includes the building industry, includes partnerships across private and public sector. It includes the way in which we reform planning and look in particular at design-led planning models, which use prototypes. And we also need to find a way to provide government as guarantor or providing limited finance, like KfW in Germany is a particular example. There's a whole suite of tools that are very achievable and within our means that will enable an environment conducive to innovation. That's the starting point that we don't have right. And I really think we need to find a way to address it.
Totally. Well, I think that will be the subject of the next Melbourne University conference, I think, perhaps. You never know. I would like to, before we finish up, we've got a couple minutes left. I wonder if, Zara, whether we could see your diagramming of our conversation. I suspect it might be like the first draft of Finnegan's Wake. I'm not sure. But no, it's looking really... It's amazing how you've done that on the fly. And there's two, so we filled 2 boards. So I think we can all be very happy with that. Wow. Okay. That will all be shared afterwards, and I will go into the annals of Melbourne University's conference as part of what we've been talking about. Before we finish, before I thank our participants today, I do want to remind the silent masses out there in this remote presentation format that please do join Alan Pert at 2:30 for the launch of the I knew I was going to stumble over this. Carson Architect's new book, Public Works, which is starting right after this session. But before we finish, I'm sure the audience would, like me, thank Emma Appleton, Sophie Dyring, Andy Fergus, Thomas Gilbert, Michael Malson, Jeremy McLeod, Kerstin Thompson, and Toby Pond. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, audience, for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.